Hi, Manori.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you doing?
Pretty good.
Okay, I'm going to introduce my guest today. It's Manori Gunawardena, who's an elephant biologist. She studied elephants in Yala and later Mineria in Sri Lanka. We met, I think, in the year 2000 when I was in Yala doing a film on mugger crocodiles, and I used to see this unusual sight of a woman driving herself with a radio a receiver outside her window tracking elephants. And since then, we've been good friends. I wanted to talk to Manori, especially today, because of the news of elephant conservation being in the news. There was an elephant who died from a mouth bomb, and it was pretty tragic. And since everyone's talking about it, I wanted to get your insights on it. But before that, we are going to do three personal questions.
Okay.
Um, who are your role models, Manori?
Who are my role models? That's really a tough one. I've never thought about that before. Um, I read Gerald Doral when I was a child, and I sort of wanted to grow up to be like him. I also liked my neighborhood vet, so I toyed with becoming a veterinarian at some point, and I ended up sort of being in between right now somewhere.
So, what's your favorite book? Is it still Gerald Darrell?
I would say yes, a childhood book, that would be it.
Okay. And where are you the happiest?
Happiest is going back 20 years when I had no mobile phone and just VHF antenna and driving around a four-wheel drive in Yala.
That's one. Okay, I'm going to start with a big picture and then we'll go
Okay.
into the specifics. Okay, as you know, in India, less than 25% of elephant habitat is under strict protection, and the rest is, various patchwork of governances like revenue forest, reserve forest, unclassified forest, and so on. So even though some part of elephant habitat enjoys strict protection, our ministers seem to be very happy to, give away land for industry. So how do you do elephant conservation in a landscape like that?
So I think we have the similar issues in Sri Lanka where we have designated protected space for elephants or well for wildlife, and then we have elephants elsewhere as well. Um, and those lands, the status is sort of unknown and it's up for grabs for all kinds of development, not only just sort of big projects, but also just small scale farmers, encroachments, the natural progression of development, sort of in a village growing. That happens too. But what really does help is to go back to similar initiatives they've done with the tigers in India is to look at landscapes and look at these sort of mixed use areas and figure out which of them do need to be conserved for elephants and humans. So it's regulating types of development in these sort of in between spaces. We have really good data from Sri Lanka now. So we know that 44% of the country has elephants and people in the same space that are not protected areas. So we do have that data.
Wow. So,
What we
yeah, sorry.
so what we do with it is the tough ask. So now we know there are lots of elephants and lots of people in the same space in literally half the country. Um, that kind of data is very useful for management planning. Then you can take some sort of plan to the table. If not, ad hoc development does happen. Not that it does prevent it from happening in Sri Lanka, but at least we know the scale of the issue if we do develop certain areas.
Right. So when we're talking about elephants in farmlands, we're talking about conflict. So how do you protect people's lives and livelihoods in those kind of spaces?
So it depends on the driver of the conflict, whether it's sort of a immediate change in land or the land use, an immediate sort of a large development project, as it's happening in India, that we hear in the news all the time that the EIAs are insufficient, they don't take into account the conflict issues, they ring fence them. These are sort of commonalities right throughout this environment impact assessment process. But something that we really have to look at, especially in terms of the large ranging animals like elephants, is to look at what would be a strategic environment impact assessment or a regional environment impact assessment specific to something like elephants. And we are yet to do that in South Asia. So
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So the environment impact assessment would have mitigation measures. That's a norm. Something like preventing conflict with smaller farmers or sort of rural livelihoods can be built into those project costs. Now, we never build in defraying animal conflict costs into any kind of large project budget. And that's a huge failing in the design of this whole environment impact assessment system.
Right.
So that's one end of it. And if you look at the farmers' end of it, or sort of, small scale development, there are lots of measures. So there's a whole lot of trials that are happening in Sri Lanka now that are very successful, which are seasonal fencing for farms, for fields. And these are electrified fences. And also settlement fencing. So you sort of fence the settlement in the communities in. And these are community managed, community run. There are different models. I think they're trialing some in India, in Karnataka as well, right now. I think NCF.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few in operation at the moment.
But tell me something. So it seems like if industry takes some elephant land, there is habitat loss that's driving conflict. But then we are preventing elephants from making up for that loss by going into farmlands. So how are they supposed to survive?
So it's very location specific where the development happens. So if you are sort of taking away, say, 50% of the available habitat, or whether you're taking away 100%. I mean, if it's 100% of the available habitat and all the elephants have are settlements, it's just a no-win for both. So you really have, that's why strategic environment impact assessments are extremely important, looking at the big wider landscape, because there are certain places where there is some give, right, in development, where you can take some space away and account for it. I'm not saying it works 100%, but you can build in strong mitigation measures. It's the easiest example, I would say, something very linear, like linear infrastructure, right? Sort of a highway or a road. So then it's a matter of regulating what kind of development happens sort of as a satellite on both sides of the highway. So it's very rarely the road itself, but the sort of the ancillary development that happens when you build a road through somewhere. So that's what sort of whittles away at the habitats. So you have that strategic environment assessment. Don't just look at the footprint of the development, wider picture.
So in the recent case of this elephant who was killed by a mouth bomb, I understand that's a common problem in Sri Lanka as well. These are meant for wild boar, apparently, and then a whole range of other creatures get affected as well. So how is Sri Lanka dealing with it?
Well, actually, Sri Lanka is not dealing with it. It's now the #1 killer of elephants in Sri Lanka. It used to be gunshot. And as of 2017, we call it hakkapatas, which is in Sinhala blows your jaw, literally. That's the translation. And it's killed 64 elephants last year. We don't have a legal mechanism to prosecute because very rarely do you find people with the bomb itself. You always find the animal, and it's very hard to prove who caused it. Also, the really sad thing is that most of the elephants affected, or at least the ones that are found, are juveniles.
Really?
Yes, so it's almost 70% juveniles, and what's really interesting is that also they seem to be male calves, as opposed to
But
if you
they,
divide it by gender.
but they would be with their family groups. So how come just the male calves are going out and getting
Because
in?
that's we just don't know why, but they are going out in their groups to areas where these things are strewn. Usually they're on game trails to water holes in drier areas where wild boar and other game aggregate. And the elephants use this as well. It could be that we actually find the calves because they do get horribly injured, and it's a very slow, agonizing death. They sort of stay back. The herd leaves them, and then they're found by people. Adults do get impacted, but it's occasionally that you actually find an adult with a jaw blown off. It could be that it's a smaller explosion, so there could be a lot of injured elephants in Sri Lanka that have Hakapatas injuries. They've treated, they treat 50 to 60 a year.
Wow.
And I know of only 3 that survived.
Hmm.
And these are the calves.
How would they survive? I mean, I can imagine the bones of the mandibles are all getting blown. So how do they reconstruct?
So one, they actually did surgery and they managed to. So each one, all the 3 they did find, it wasn't very bad.
Hmm.
So it wasn't a huge explosion, but they managed to. They actually did some elephant dentistry. It's kind of interesting. So they put sort of a plate in, and that elephant's released in Udavalave National Park. It's still around. It's been out for about 5 years now. You can see her, and she kind of drools on the side of the mouth. So she's very easy to recognize. She looks maimed, but she's functioning. She's in okay body condition. She's feeding. She's been out there for about 5 years now, so she's doing okay. But most of them don't. It's a very slow, agonizing death. They can't eat, drink. It's very painful.
Yeah. You said they're on game trails. Does that mean they are these bombs are set for getting wild boar for meat and not for crop protection?
It's never for crop protection. It's always for some kind of bushmeat.
Oh, I see.
Yes. So, and it's always on some kind of waterhole game trail, especially in the dry season when you get these animals congregating or walking towards water.
Hmm. So
They actually arrested a couple of people. Sorry, go ahead.
go on. If you were finishing that, please do.
So, yeah, so they do find people with the bombs, but the thing is then it's meant for wild boar or, well, poaching, not the death of an elephant. The death of an elephant has huge penalties, uh, lesser penalties for others. And it's kind of strange that this device that they make, it's improvised. Uh, so under Sri Lankan laws, unless you actually find someone feeding it to an animal, it's illegal manufacture of fireworks. That's what you can get prosecuted for, which is actually just a fine.
Hmm. Right.
So it's
And
kind
is
of
it geographically restricted to parts of the country, or is it a widespread problem?
so it started in the eastern province, just post-war Sri Lanka, up in Trincomalee, northeastern Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm.
It started in Trincomalee district. We started seeing it in the field a lot, of all these wild boar. And then now it's all over Sri Lanka. It's all over the dry zone. So it came to the south maybe 5 years ago. And now again, in the south, it's the number 1 killer of elephants. in anywhere where people and elephants sort of intermingle, which is most of the dry lowlands in Sri Lanka, this is the number one cause of death right now.
Wow. So how do you okay, so I assume that this has got nothing to do with what governance that land is under. It could be a protected area or land that has a lower degree of protection. It doesn't matter. Am I right?
It doesn't matter wherever people have access, but there's less inside national parks. Most of it are in these sort of wilderness and forest areas that are outside the proper national parks itself. You don't see it as much. There's also fewer of it laid in areas where there's a lot of free-ranging cattle. So if there are lots of buffaloes, people don't tend to lay it's very localized just because, the cattle herder comes after you if you do it.
Right. But we just saw an image of a horrible image of a cow with a jaw blown off somewhere in India as well. So it seems to be a developing problem. So of the many measures that have been tried to keep elephants away, you mentioned that you're looking at seasonal fencing, keeping fencing in villages rather than fencing farmlands. How does that work? What is more effective?
So both are depending on the lay of the land, and actually there's sort of the third option, which is fencing off if there is a clear ecological line. So you could actually draw a line saying, development on one side, elephants on the other side, where there's a clear line, an ecological divide. Then you could have sort of a fence along the ecological boundary. These are the fences we sometimes see on borders of national parks, for example. These are the kinds of fences authorities tend to put up. But, in Sri Lanka, it's a patchwork. It's a mosaic where you have forest patches, then you have agricultural land, you have seasonal agriculture, then you have permanent settlements, and then you have irrigated agriculture. So you have all these, the mix. And when you have this mix, it's better to sort of fence off the little mosaics and have a little give. So the seasonal fencing are for paddy fields and for seasonal cultivation, where the fencing by a farmer association, usually it's some kind of collective arrangement, and they dismantle it during the fallow season because people don't occupy those spaces. Settlement fences are permanent, and the onus is on the community to maintain their own fence. If not, the elephants in your backyard.
Right.
Right now, so northwestern Sri Lanka and north central Sri Lanka, there are, I think, 22 fences that the Department of Wildlife itself has put up around communities, following the pilot study done by the Center of Conservation Research. That's Dr. Prithu Fernando. He piloted several fences pretty much in every HEC district in Sri Lanka. And now the Department of Wildlife is actually erecting some of those fences. So this is northwestern province.
So someone asked a question, and Pinto Rodriguez, if bee fences are effective in Sri Lanka.
So bee fences in general fall into this category of things we do to experiment with elephants, right? To keeping elephant deterrence. And they have trialed it in African countries. It has worked, but it's not practical, even if it did work, in the scale it's required to be applied in our part of the world. So we're talking about a very intense human-elephant conflict. We have different ecology of bees. So nobody really looks at the ecology of the bees, the carrying capacity of bees. How many hives can you support in an acre of agriculture? All that comes into play. So actually, beehive fences don't really work because they don't apply to our context. and the way we do agriculture and the way elephants move through our landscapes.
Hmm.
It's just a visual barrier, literally.
Right. So ultimately, do you think in the future there is space for these large animals in the world we live in with increasing industrialization?
There will be space as much as we let them have space. But having said that, Janaki, Sri Lanka's had huge irrigation projects in the 80s. So Mahavali project completely irrigated the dry lowlands in the late 80s, early 90s. And they set aside protected areas, but at that time, it was conventional knowledge that they had at the time, they set aside the riverine areas. So right along the largest river in Sri Lanka is a row of protected areas that were declared back then, primarily to kind of control elephants because there was going to be large scale agriculture. And yes, we've had increased elephant deaths, but the elephants are still there since 1980s. Elephants have not lost a huge amount of their range in Sri Lanka yet. Even with the intense amount of conflict and development that's happening, they've lost what we calculate about 10% of the space that they had since 1980. And that's when we do calculate the space, we're actually calculating the space for the herds. It does not stop bull elephants from going wherever they want.
Hmm. So compared to other Asian elephant range countries, what are the unique challenges that Sri Lanka faces that we don't face in India, for instance? This is asked by Bidisha Mukherjee.
That you don't face in India?
Yeah.
Well, one thing is that we do have an opportunity to do, because we are so small, that we can actually do a countrywide plan. Or even just a regional plan. It's actually doable in the scale of things. If you take a district in Sri Lanka, it's a tiny, tiny area compared to India. So if you need to implement a plan, it certainly can be done. And the second thing is that I do think we know enough about elephants on the ground now to make some really good decisions in management. If you remember, we went back all over India 15 years ago, and I think I asked everyone, why aren't you collaring elephants? And I think we got laughed at. I remember that distinctly. But since the late 90s, I think 100 or some over 100 collars have been. So elephant movements are known, ranges are known, habitat requirements are known, distribution is to make very good management choices. That's the difference. You do have it in India. It's localized to some areas or some study sites, but it's very, very small.
Mm. The plan you were talking about, are you talking about an elephant conservation plan or a land use management plan?
So there are two things. There is a draft elephant conservation policy for Sri Lanka that's based on landscapes and declaring landscapes and mixed use areas. That's been at play since 2006. There is a revision that is the draft revision going through the final bits of it being put out. Again, based on landscape, strategic environment assessments, based on elephant distribution, then also mitigation measures for human-elephant conflict. So that's in place right now. What's really lacking is leverage to bring in this strategic element to development planning, even at district level, because there is no sort of legislative or legal standing for what you call a strategic environment assessment. It's something that you could require in some kind of national planning policy, but that's largely lacking for environment in general. This is just not elephants, but environment in general. Every environment project just looks at its footprint, direct footprint, not the indirect impacts. So that's something we really have to push for.
So earlier you mentioned that when there is a development happening in elephant land, that you have to build elephant conflict mitigation measures into the plan. So by that, what do you mean? Do you mean erecting electric fences and stuff to, keep protect the installation or the community that's going to come in from elephants? How does that work?
So it's two things. One is dependent on the type of development that you're doing, what kind of land use and land intensive spaces there are. Second is that a lot of times the onus for conflict mitigation or conservation services is put on the state authorities or the conservation entities. So the buck is passed for human-elephant conflict. In Sri Lanka is the Department of Wildlife Conservation, which would be the Forest Department in India. So after the fact, or very much later to the table, they're brought in to come up with mitigatory measures. The budgets are never from these large projects. So whether it's a state-funded project or whether it's a donor-funded project or whether it's a private project, private party investment, the cost of mitigation is never built into the project costs.
Yeah.
It's something that's passed on to some state entity that deals with the issue. It's either a social service issue or a conservation sector issue. And that's something that we have to break. If not, we cannot sustain the services required if they do need a fence, for example. So fencing is something that everyone puts in their EIA. So if it says elephant, they'll say fencing or corridor. I mean, those are the two words I see in every EIA I review. It's corridor and fencing. But where we fail is actually the application of the fencing and the application of, when they say corridors, I'm saying broadly, leaving a little space for them to move. It's not these linear long things, but just adjacent space. Sort of the path of least resistance is what I like to call it. And that is never brought to the table at the time or the project inception phase. So when they're actually mapping it out and drawing it out. It's always after the fact, so it's very hard to build it in once they've decided on the footprint of a project. And that's a complete reform of the environment impact assessment process that's required. And it's as strong as how you build sort of the terms of reference for it, especially sort of when you look at these elephants or any other species, actually, large ranging species.
Does Sri Lanka do compensation? Does it give compensation to farmers who lose their crops to elephants?
It does. It does if tree crops are damaged. So if it's permanent crops, like you lose coconut or some kind of tree crops, they give compensation for damage to houses, and then they give damage, property damage, and then they give compensation for injuries or loss of life. So 120 people were killed by elephants last year.
Wow.
That's the highest number of human deaths per capita in the world by elephants.
Wow. That's a lot.
That's a lot. You know how small this country is. And it's just gone up in the last 10 years.
And why is that?
I think, well, one thing is that post-war Sri Lanka, there's a huge agricultural drive. So agriculture expanded. People get about more. People are a lot more mobile than before. I think people were a lot more careful back then when they lived around elephants. And now there are lots more motorcycles, lots more auto rickshaws. So people get about very late in the night. Usually what people who live in forested areas would say is common sense. So that's lacking. That's lacking. So if you look at the elephant deaths, it's mostly men. Very few women are killed by elephants. It's mostly men who are getting about very late at night.
Yeah.
And accidents happen. That's increased. Elephant deaths have increased. So since it's almost doubled. So in 2010, it was 260 250 some elephants, and now we're 420.
Right. So Bidisha has another question. Do elephants go into the sea often because they live in coastal forests and Sri Lanka is an island? So,
Uh, they don't go into the sea often. There is this one place in Trincomalee, which is a massive harbor, and then there are a couple of islands that are forested. And there are very old records, even down to when the British were camped there during World War II, of elephants swimming across the bay. So they will not get into sort of the ocean with waves. They've been driven in, and they will swim. They can swim. There are a couple of times that collared elephants, well, translocated elephants, decided to take a swim to find their way home. And they've been brought back by the Navy. It happened quite a few years ago, so this was part of a study. So we knew it because the collared elephant actually was 5 nautical miles out to sea, and the Navy had to tow it back to Trincomalee. Because he had never seen the sea. He was from central Sri Lanka, where he thought it was a big tank and thought he would swim across the tank. I mean, I don't know. That's what I'm guessing the elephant thought at the time.
yeah. Okay, so elephants live in matriarchal family groups. So how does being a woman researcher studying elephants change the way you view elephant society?
The way being in matriarchal groups. It's not really matriarchal groups per se, but you are much more attentive to the nuances in behavior. So it's not just female groups, but elephants in general. I think you do become a little bit more sensitive to the nuances in behavior and the nuances in individuals if you studied the same elephants for a very long time. So you start picking up characters, I mean, we are not supposed to sort of name them and like them and, have your favorite elephant. But you certainly have them. And I must say my favorite elephants are some bull elephants.
Why is that?
Because they're trouble. They're fun. They're interesting. They are. They're challenged. They're challenging everything. They challenge people all the time. We throw all these devices at them, and then they throw it back at us. That's what makes it really fun. That's what's fun about studying elephants, because it's this increasing, upping the ante, and us thinking, yes, we know what they're thinking, and they actually are. We don't.
Right. So, what were the difficulties you faced as a woman in a man's world, as a way of speaking, in a manner of speaking?
Well, actually, Janaki, I mean, well, you've been to Sri Lanka when I was working in Yala. It was wartime, so there weren't not many people. To be honest, I really never felt there was a gender issue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was very lucky that my colleagues were great. That wasn't an issue. Yes, there is some bias, or there's some ogling saying, "Oh, why is she driving around?" Literally. But then you just get on with it. And I have never, all these years of working, felt unsafe working by myself, driving around. We didn't have phones and all that stuff, radios back then. I don't think that the gender card really mattered. I don't think it does matter anymore.
Good. That's good.
I never use the qualifier of a female scientist.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I never use. I never have, and I've never had to.
Right. So there's another question from Viren Chandrasekhar. Do elephants socialize with other species?
I wouldn't say they socialize. You can see they associate with other species. So your typical waterhole, you would have a bunch of buffaloes. The elephants and the buffaloes get along, as in there's no animosity. But do they socialize? No, they don't. But they do associate with some species more than others. So if you go to something like a typical waterhole, you'll see them hanging around with a bunch of buffaloes because there is cattle everywhere. But you don't see this antagonistic relationship between cattle and elephants as
Mhm.
such. So they don't really have a species they associate with it. I mean, I think elephants are quite snobby that way. They just kind of know who's who. I always think elephants know they recognize the individuals in their groupings, or just like we know people or recognize people or associate people. I think they recognize individuals.
Do you think they recognized you when you were studying them and they were seeing you almost every day?
I think they recognize the sound of the car.
Oh,
Yeah.
you don't
Because
think they recognized you as a person?
no, because we very rarely got down on foot. And if we did go in on foot to study herds for radio tracking, we were very careful not to disturb them because herds are very skittish around humans. But they certainly know the engine sound of the vehicles we used.
Hmm.
They were
And how
much
did they
calmer.
react?
They were
Oh,
calmer. They were really calm, as opposed to if you go in a different vehicle. So, they used to just walk right across, just kind of ignore you.
hmm.
Um,
But I remember being in that vehicle, I think in Mineria with you, and we were surrounded by a herd and they were putting their trunks into the vehicle to smell us.
oh, yes, yes.
So you still don't think that they could recognize you by smell?
No, I think it's the vehicle. Because that's the same guy we use all the time. So it's the same Jeep. Because when you change the Jeep, the behavior is slightly different. So they associate the sound of the vehicle with not disturbing them. That's the most important thing. It's not that, they like us. They associate us as not a threat. They're not a threat. So what they do is, oh, yeah, it's them, they're okay. That's how they look at it. Yeah, they're just like, oh, yeah, I know them. You're safe. They get curious. They do get curious if you sit still for a long time, especially the juveniles.
Hmm.
Mineria is crazy now, though. There are hundreds of vehicles. The
Sorry.
elephants are not. There are hundreds of vehicles now in
Oh.
Mineria. So when you were here there about 10 years ago, it was calm. It's the same with most of our national parks. So the elephants are not as polite anymore.
That's sad to see that change.
It is.
Yeah. It's been great fun, Manori, to talk about elephants again after all these years. Thank you
Been
so
too long.
much.
You're welcome.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Take care.
You too.